I don't do scary. I once entered a contest and I tried to write a scary story for that contest. It didn't work out. I knew for a fact that it wasn't going to be scary before I started. Because I do scary wrong. When I watch a scary story or read a scary story, I misunderstand it. It just seems like a monster that you gotta chase, you know? Scary stories, to me, generally just seem like they're super intense dragon hunting stories. So when I write one, I think I do it wrong. In fact, I know that I do it wrong. I've written stories and given them to friends who actually know how to read a scary story, and they tell me that it's not scary, just ambient. That's okay with me. I decided that that was okay with me. Life is unsettling enough without worrying about scary stories. I mean, other people like them, and that's fine. Not everybody needs to write a scary story. So the story that I have written instead is atmospheric. That's the word. People like the word atmospheric, or at least I like the word atmospheric. I wrote it about what I took as frightening whenever I was in as close to a scary situation as I actually was. Not real fear, but that kind of like Halloweeny tingling. I wrote about that instead, because that's more what I know how to do, I guess. Works for me. This story also features characters from my novel, City Song, that's out. And I like how it turned out. I think that it was a fun... Well, it doesn't matter what I think. It features characters from my novel, which you can find as well. It's from the short story collection Ragged Museum. It's kind of long. I'm going to get going. So I'll take a deep breath. Let's begin. Corn maze, for autumn and for nighttime. Verse 1. Ghoul. Reg threaded through the shifting crowd. He had always been good at crowds. He could find the gaps without looking. Used to be like a sixth sense. Then it turned out it wasn't like a sixth sense. He could feel the edges of people where their self ended and the world started. Someone tripped, he sidestepped. Someone waved their arms to tell their grand story. He slid to the left, keeping his 2 cups of hot cider level. He had a knack for sensing auras. He'd only learned recently. Because he was touch dominant, they weren't invisible things, or they were invisible things. They scratched, heated, and scented the air around people, creating texture behind and beyond usual senses. Magic. He did that. Feeling impressed from this display of his one physical talent, Reg got through the worst of the scrum. He'd looked for Poppy. She sat on a wooden fence, more decoration than anything. The fence, not the Poppy, although it depended who you asked. He sort of hoped she had seen him, but she looked in a different direction, intent as if on something she recognized. Reg shrugged. He padded across the packed dirt, squinting through the disorienting light of the farm at night. Tall, white lights lit some places, but couldn't fight away most of the dark. It made the whole nearby world a war between light and dark, cold and warm, sound and silence. A barn over there, a cornfield in the distance, a farm it seemed. It claimed, it suggested it was still a farm. It wasn't. It was a themed park. People walked in and out of the corn in street clothes and sneakers. some in face paint. Halloween tingled the air. Reg could smell it, but he could also feel it. October had a particular texture, creaky, artificial, and with something hiding and waiting behind everything. The hiding thing was probably winter, but winter's mean side. There was a truck that smelled of kettle corn. There was a gift shop. And every now and then a man with a chainsaw chased a screaming gaggle of kids out of the exit to the bit of the cornfield set up as a haunted one. Reg did not know where to look. He looked at Poppy because he knew Poppy, and she had a calmness about her all the time that helped Reg deal with being overstimulated. She took her hot cider from him without comment or eye contact. He leaned on the fence where she sat. For a while he sipped his cider, enjoying the steam on his cold nose, and stared at the crowds moving in and out of the patches and slashes of light and dark. He let it all sway together in a big fuzz. Crowds have auras as much as people do. The aggregate aura of crowd can tell you a lot about what might happen next, although not reliably, because a crowd without much common purpose doesn't have much common aura. This one really only had in common a vague sense of having a good time, but the warmth of it was itchy rather than caressing. Uncomfortable warmth, not soothing. It was a mixed feeling. Another little gaggle of mostly young girls screaming ran away from the chainsaw man in the corn. "Did you see it?" Poppy asked. Reg considered saying yes, then realized he hadn't. "You'll have to be more specific," Reg said. "There's a sort of thing running around." Poppy gestured sort of forward with her cider. "You could be more vague," Reg said, "if you tried." "A sort of otherworldly thing. Owl sort of thing," Poppy said. "I think it's a ghoul." "You think?" "Almost certain." Reg watched a group of a half-dozen guys walk past in hoodies and white, screaming ghost face masks from the Scream movies. Only one sampling of the 1,001 ghoulies and ghosties wandering the world tonight. "I mean, points for effort, but," Reg started to say. He glanced at Poppy, who did not even bother rolling her eyes as per usual. She demonstrated how stupid he was by smirking. She had a versatile smirk. This one said, "Go on, finish that one, I dare you." Reg cleared his throat. After a moment of musing, Reg said, "What even is a ghoul? I mean, I feel like the movies are full of them, but it seems like the movies haven't got a good idea what they are either." "Remember that djinn from back a few months ago? You know, the mad one? Haunting that basement and raving about ancient days," Poppy said. Reg nodded. "Remember his servants? Ghoul's more or less one of them. A ghoul's like a sort of weak sort of djinn. A demon, really, but not exactly working from hell. Still way more magical than your average corn maze attending kid, though," Reg said. "Yeah," Poppy said. "And malicious?" Reg said. Poppy nodded. "Pop culture's got that right about them. Things love this season. They eat dead things." "Don't most things eat dead things?" Reg said, because he never missed a chance at a bad joke, which is why he would probably die alone and unloved. "But you know how, like, the whole greenie movement's all about, like, making it so animals they eat have the least amount of trauma possible before they die? And one of the arguments they say is that, like, as it turns out, the meat off a scared animal goes all bitter on account of the adrenaline." Reg nodded. "Is it? Does a ghoul like the taste of adrenaline-seasoned meat? Is that where this is going?" he asked. Poppy answered with a smirk. She toasted with her cider in a non-committal way, then sipped it. "Nah, a ghoul's about eating the fear. What's funny here is it's got clothes on." "Why's that funny?" "Well, a ghoul's not always a thing with a body. Might be sharing a body." "Might be? Might be." Reg huddled with his nervous frown and his shivers. and his own hot cider deeper into his jacket. "The Hebsmeister giveth," Poppy said. She laughed. She had a throaty laugh, and it didn't happen often. It generally perked Reg up when it did. And Reg would have just dismissed it as a creepy story, another one of Poppy's little moments, except an aura pushed cold on his cheek. Something different than any of the warm, dizzy auras of the young people enjoying themselves. This aura cut through the rest like a cold draft in a dark room, like a moment of silence in a loud crowd. Something perceived by everyone, but understood by no one. It was broadcasting. It was intentionally spreading out. It had magic too, and it liked to spread unease. This one spread like a mist of discomfiture, an extra grasping cold that made the cold of the night feel homey. Reg tried to see the center of it. The ghoul helped by coming closer. A slim person in black jeans and a black jacket, the black hood of its sweatshirt put up. It looked like a he, but its gaunt face could have been either. It stared at the field of corn, its sunken eyes wide and its thin lips taut, in a hungry grin. When Reg saw it, the ghoul seemed intent on the corn maze. It flinched under Reg's eyes, maybe sensing that someone actually saw it, since most people would probably only see what their minds preferred seeing. A small and maybe a little creepy goth kid, not a skeletal, dry-skinned creature with breath that smelled of stone and long-dead spiders. The ghoul paused. It looked at them, first at Poppy, then at Reg. It had for a moment a quizzical expression, like it didn't know what they were. Then its grin came back. It kept on its way. Soon it left the lights and disappeared into the corn. "That's not the haunted corn maze," Reg said. "It's got a lot more haunted now," Poppy said. Reg nodded. He sipped his hot cider. The ripples of the ghoul's passing still tickled him like a wake made of cobwebs. Reg looked at Poppy. Poppy ignored him for a second. When it became clear he wouldn't be deterred by mere ignoring, she looked at him. "Yes?" she said. "Well?" Reg said. "Well?" Poppy said. "Well," Reg said, "what are we going to do about it?" "We," Poppy said. "Do? About what?" "About an eldritch monster trudging into a corn maze full of unsuspecting normals," Reg said. He felt suddenly a little exasperated. "Why should we do anything about it?" Poppy said. "He's not hurting me." "But he might hurt other people," Reg said. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Poppy said. "Let's not..." "What?" Reg said. "He's a ghoul thingy." "You don't even know what that means," Poppy said. "There's no reason to assume that he's not here just to enjoy the corn maze and the autumn air just like everybody else." "Is that likely?" Reg said. "Why wouldn't it be?" Poppy said. "I'm sure that ghouls like your American Halloween spirit as much as any of these kids." "But is it likely?" Reg repeated. Poppy's smirk dropped. She frowned. "What are you trying to do, Poppycock?" she said. Reg hesitated. He said. "The right thing?" He almost asked it. He wasn't actually certain what the right thing was. Poppy smirked back in place, patted Reg's cheek. This smirk said, "You're cute." Reg frowned. He sighed, and he stared at the crowd, and he sipped his hot cider. For a while they just sat. Another gaggle of people ran out of the haunted corn maze. The chainsaw-wielding masked man somehow seemed far less frightful than it had a minute ago. "But supposing, just for the sake of it, that we did decide to do something," Reg said in a tone that only communicated innocent curiosity. He knew that it did because he had practiced it. "I know what you're trying to do, Poppycock," Poppy said. "It won't work." "It might," Reg said. As he said it, Poppy hopped off the fence and strode toward the crowd, where she lost herself. "Okay," Reg said, half sighing. "I guess it won't." He leaned against the fence for a few minutes more. Then he made an abrupt move in the direction of the corn. He had to trudge across bare dirt, then through the crunching, battered-down stalks that had been flattened to make open space on the walk toward the corn. Verse 2. Maze. Sounds thinned. Darkness thickened. Reg walked across the long, empty stretch of ground that wasn't supposed to be the way into the corn maze, which meant that Reg had no company. At every step, the distance felt a little longer. Bright lights lit the world far behind him. Bright lights shone on bridges deep in the corn maze. The corn scratched up at the empty night sky, a million overgrown splinters, gray in the black, and whispering. It had a voice, or a million thin ones, but he didn't speak husk. He set his now half-empty hot cider on a post of a wooden fence that surrounded the maze. He didn't glance back. He might lose his nerve. If he looked back, the brightness behind him limned the edges of his sight and made the shadows between the corn darker. Motionless, it gestured to him. It soaked up light, caused a flow. He felt it pulling. Ducking between the posts of the fence, he shuffled across the last few yards of dirt. The sounds and lights grew less with every step. Then he pushed the cold tips of his fingers between two dust-dry stalks of corn. He took a step through. The corn pushed against him like it wanted to keep him out. The darkness parted, though. It gave way for him. He stumbled into the maze. The sound and light didn't disappear, not entirely. They belonged to a different world now, an adjacent world. This world had its own darkness, crawling out of every corner just out of sight and just inside suspicion. It had its own whispers. They had no words, but had meaning. It was clear to Reg that this world belonged to someone. Reg felt as certain that his presence was known as if someone had shaken his hand. He felt a cold awareness look at him and smile. Quite out of his own control, he felt a shaking that kind of fear. It began at his knees and worked its way up as caressing as the most attentive seduction. A slushy cold puddled in his gut. He knew it would take hold of him. He already felt himself turning into himself to hide. "You're different," said a voice behind him. It was a thin, hiding behind the cold and full to the edges of the dark. Reg turned. He couldn't so much see the pale corn stalks in the dark as sense a texture in the darkness. At first, nothing different, just more dark. Then the darkest shadow moved. It had limbs as thin as the shadows. It had a smile. It looked at him. "You're friendly. Warm," the voice said. Every inch of Reg's skin crawled. He stuck his hands in his coat pockets, trying to find something. He didn't know what he had. Something would help. He glanced down while he did, away from the shape in the shadows. His attention slipped. Something happened to him. A pinching in his side, like a sudden harsh cramp. It released as fast as it seized. He could see better in the dark all of a sudden. He could hear, too. Not better, but the people sounded more interesting. He heard some voice getting closer. Teenagers talking about how much they didn't feel even a little bit afraid to go into the haunted corn maze next. They were in the next path over. Perfect. Reg put the hood of his coat up. He paced the group of teenagers. "You're such a geek, Doug," one of the girls said. "All I'm saying is that I don't think that they usually think through the plot of haunted houses," apparently Doug said. "Which, breaks the mood for me. I'm not scared, just disgusted." "They're supposed to be disgusting," one of the others said. "Not on a literary level," Doug said. "Wait, you're not going to try and ruin the whole thing, are you?" said the first girl. "I don't care that it's fake. I want to be scared." "I don't get that either," Doug said. "Why do people like being scared?" "I don't know, Doug," she said. "Some people just like it." "Then you're going to love me," a voice growled from behind them. A dark figure appeared behind them. It seemed to clap into existence, to knit itself out of the shadows. It had something off about its face and voice. It looked just enough wrong to seem unreal. The teenagers screamed and swore, and they ran for it. What they left behind was a patch of shadow that grew, after a moment, into a much less unsettling shape. A shape that couldn't help but snort his laughter. The mild glamour that he had cast to emphasize and limn the sharpest features of his already slim face faded, leaving Reg's face normal again. Reg chuckled. The corn husks shivered around him. "Not sure why I did that," Reg muttered. He shrugged. "Where have you gone, you little monster?" He looked around for any clues to point where the ghoul had gone. What caught his attention first was the laughter of another little gaggle of teenagers a couple of lanes over. It distracted him. He skulked towards the laughter, and the returning mild glamour raised the corners of his eyebrows and grin a little too high to look entirely comfortable. Verse 3. Guts. Poppy frowned over the steam of her hot cider. The twigs of the corn maze scratched at the dark in the distance. Something untoward was occurring there. She had just watched several teenagers run out of it and complain to one of the employees of the farm, which would not have worried her in the slightest, or should not have. She would have been amused by it on behalf of the ghoul, who she suspected had come out to do a bit of eerie lurking. She knew a few of those guys, and they like an evening of eerie lurking. Most were fairly harmless, although some weren't. So she wouldn't have worried if it weren't for her gut. Her damned gut. She rubbed her belly, cursing it in the back of her mind, because it had turned into a nest of worry, which she did not care to indulge because she hated feeling concern. Unconstructive, moody sensation it was. She kept telling herself so while she walked toward the corn maze. "Honestly, the dude was like 7 feet tall, and he had this mad grin," one of the teenagers complained to the employee. Poppy overheard when she passed. "All right," the employee said, reaching for his walkie-talkie. "We'll take care of it. We'll send somebody to deal with them." Poppy's jaw tightened. She set her hot cider down and hustled toward the maze. She had to get there before any of these farm employees stirred up more trouble than they could handle. People emptied the corn maze in frightened little knots. They ran out with more unsettled shouting than the gaggles being chased by the chainsaw man in the haunted maze next cornfield over. Poppy jigged back and forth around the hurried, frightened people. The fringe of the maze looked to her eyes like the lower jaw of a grin with bad teeth. One person stood near its edge, looking back at it, apparently unconcerned by everyone leaving. She recognized him and his hooded jacket. Poppy ran at him. She jumped to take a big step off the top rail of the fence around the corn maze. It put her into a flying leap at the smallish person. Pointless, but as efficient as any other way of getting over the fence. He didn't look around till she almost landed on top of him. When he did see her flying through the air at him, he took a stumbling step back and cussed in what sounded like Arabic. Poppy thumped in front of him. He backed away, and because he did, she advanced on him. She didn't think she advanced with any particular menace, but he kept backing away anyway until he bumped into the pole at the edge of the cornfield. Some hot cider sloshed from the paper cup he held and splashed on his hand. Something had changed about his face. The sallowness had warmed. He had color. He looked haggard, like he'd just gotten over the flu. Boding that. More than that, an otherworldliness had left him. He felt mundane, like a skinny goth kid, but just a kid. She shoved him against a post at the edge of the field. "Way to go, mate," she said, her voice low and calm. "You have 2 seconds." Wasn't sure what she expected. She didn't expect him to laugh. Or maybe she did. She would probably have laughed. She would have laughed, the same ragged laugh, no energy in it, and a gut full of relief. After all, his soul had just finished with the worst diarrhea in the world, and he'd survived. He must feel emptier than the worst dump he'd ever had. "He's not here anymore," he said in a tired voice. "He said he saw someone more fun." "Who?" Poppy said. The empty goth kid didn't have anything else to say. He just laughed his big, scratchy, empty laugh. He slumped to his knees. But Poppy already knew who. She looked at the tangling stalks of corn. They rattled in the wind and shook themselves at her and howled, a crowd both silent and loud. Verse 4. Empathy. Poppy stumbled into the corn maze. The dry smell of husks scratched her lungs. The silence rose up and swallowed her voice. The ground felt like it bent under her like a firm trampoline. A single voiceless whisper reached into her mind and said, "I know you. Welcome." The ground under her feet wouldn't stay. Gravity wobbled, stalks of corn, pale like finger bones, rattled. The sky dropped, close enough to touch and deep enough for drowning. She had a dream once, a recurring nightmare, if she was honest, but she'd only told him about having it once. The world stretched wrong. It was the sense that she'd never be in control that had gripped her. Permanent tunnel vision in every moment. Again, like the old days. He knew it, so he made it. Made the sky low and the paths stretch. Made the world widen. It moved away without moving. She walked but stayed still. With a snarl, she reached under her coat. She pulled the bowie knife out. Then she ran at the corn and slashed through it. The hushing sound of her knife going through the corn sounded like the word "safe" over and over again. She shoved through the gap she made onto the next path. She didn't look back, but the pressure on the heel of her boots felt like the ground rolling up behind her like a wave. Every second she felt a little dizzier. She ran at the next row of corn and slashed her way through it as well. In the next path, she paused long enough to close her eyes and stand still, breathing deeply through the aching twisting behind her ears. She listened. Over there she heard someone. Only one person. He sounded like he was reciting. She ran at the corn, blocking her from going that way, and slashed through it. Somehow that corn felt a little thicker. Its dry leaves reached their dry tips to scrabble at the backs of her hands. It left little cuts, promising bigger ones. The hushing sound of her knife was a little louder. Slashing at the corn left her a little tired. The dust kicked up from the dry corn made her breathing a little harder. The ground held her up just a little worse. She gritted her teeth. If this was how it would be, she steeled herself for a fight. Verse 5. Safe. "Safe! Safe!" Red shouted at the little clearing he had made in the middle of his little world. He corrected himself. His maze. He corrected himself again. The ghoul's maze. Only it wasn't the ghoul's maze anymore. Not now that Red had made it safe. It is absolutely necessary for the peace and safety of mankind that some of Earth's dark, dead corners and unplumbed depths be left alone. He started to recite at the sky, lest sleeping abnormalities wake to resurgent life and blasphemously surviving nightmares squirm and splash out of their black lairs to newer and whiter conquests. He heard a crashing through the corn. He spun to look at the dark. At it. A person. He thought he recognized them. "Lovecraft," he announced. He smiled. That guy might have been a little too in love with obscurity, but he knew how to describe fear. Apropos to my current situation. He raised his hands, which shook past his control. Reg thought he recognized the scratched, bruised person. She had a big knife. "Hey, man, you look terrible," he said. She tried to speak, but she could only cough. She dropped her knife and leaned on her knees, rasping to catch her breath. "It's okay," Reg said. "I'm king here. You're safe." "Safe?" said the person managed to say. She had a smoky voice, something familiar about it. "What are you talking about?" she said, between wheezing breaths. "You're not the monster here," she said. "That's true," Reg said. He raised his shaking hands, gesturing at the whole of the little world. "I got rid of the monsters." "I know of one you missed, mate," she said. "What?" Reg said. He stared at her. "Where?" She tried to talk. All the bruises and scratches seemed to be catching up with her. Her coat was in tatters. Some of the corn stalks' leaves still clung to her. The corn rattled in the wind. She made a weak gesture, asking him to come closer. Although it pained him to do it, he took a few shaky steps. Then he had to lean close to hear what she breathed. "What did you say?" he asked. "Who's the last monster?" "I am Poppycock," she whispered. The first punch staggered him. With the second she decked him. He thumped to the ground unconscious. Shaking her aching right hand, Poppy frowned at Reg. Unconscious, eyes closed, his nose bleeding, he looked back. He looked back without his eyes. He looked back with his intentions, his malice, his fear. He, this time, was the other face behind Reg. "Trust me, love," Poppy said. She had her knife again. She had it under Reg's chin. "You don't want to stay in there. Ride the chute to the afterlife with him. I have my priorities way messed up." The second hidden face glared. It thought. It considered. It cussed her out silently, in the magic, laid curses on her, but mild ones, because he knew the score. He faded, like bad ideas turned to mist. He seeped out of Reg's edges. Reg didn't change. Not physically, but he looked different. Poppy didn't pray. She didn't hold with it, which might have been why she bluffed so well. The ground under her feet smoothed out and became firm again. She breathed easier every moment and grew less dizzy with each breath. She watched the sky fill again, with stars. All of the voiceless whispering faded, leaving behind the senseless whispering of a breeze through dried corn. That's when the shakes started. Poppy had to sit down for a while. Outro. Reg had an awful headache. He woke up in a car driving back into town. The darkness outside stretched for an infinity as far as he could tell, and it looked entirely natural, which made him grateful. He glanced around. Poppy was covered in scratches and bruises. Reg looked away again, now hot with embarrassment. "I made a mess of that," he said. "Remember it, do you?" Poppy said, through lips with cuts on them. Reg didn't bother nodding. "Did we learn something, then?" she asked. Reg nodded. "What was it?" she asked. "Trust Poppy," he said. "That's right, mate." You made it for the outro. There you go. That was my Halloween story. I like writing stories that are slightly associated with events and things that I feel strongly about, without necessarily writing about those things. I don't know why. It sort of attracts me. I don't know. I find Scary creatures, the question is, Brittany's asking, why are scary creatures that constantly grin so much more unsettling? Very good question. I have no idea. If I had to sort of like psychoanalyze it, though, then I would say that it's probably because originally grinning was a threat. Biologically, we're designed to think of grinning as threats. Chimpanzees still do it. Chimpanzees grin to threaten each other, and we, on some level, are primates. I've always been suspicious that excessive grinning, when it's clear that there's no good intention, means threat on a biological level. That's my suspicion, but I'm not entirely certain about that. But it's a good tool to use in storytelling. So that comes out of Ragged Museum, short stories. I'm getting kind of close. I'm within spitting distance of the end of this set of short stories, and so I'm considering, when I am done with these short stories, doing readings of my novel. If that sounds like a good idea, then I will. But I've got to keep thinking about it to decide. Yes. So, there you go. That's the story. Comes from Ragged Museum, and the characters are featured in the novel City Song as well. Goodness sakes, I'm all wore out, so I'm going to go and drink some water, because that's the healthy thing to do. Same time next week? Yeah? Good.